I'm Diane here. I'm president of Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center. I'm so happy that you can all join us today for this special presentation, and I hope that you really enjoy it. Please be sure to turn off your video on the bottom of the screen if you don't want your picture to be shown, because we do plan to share this on social media. We plan to share it on YouTube, and we plan to show it on our website and probably on Facebook also. Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center is very happy and proud to present this presentation from Jennie, A History of Jewish Life in Biddeford Saco. Jennie is a fourth generation member of one of Bidderford, Maine's first oldest Jewish families, and a lifelong member of the community. She grew up in Saco. She now lives in Biddeford. She's a mother of two teenagers. She is a member of the Congregation Etz Chaim. She
It's Etz Chaim.
Oh, Etz Chaim.
It's okay.
Sorry,
Jennie. That's okay. Red Sox.
Sorry, Etz Chaim. Okay. And she currently works at the University of New England as a writer and editor in the Office of Communications. She is also on the board of Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center, and she is the chair of the Marketing and Advertising Committee. We're so grateful and happy that she was willing, and I know with her busy schedule, it's been very difficult. I'm so happy and grateful that she was willing to do this special presentation in honor of Jewish American Month. And I appreciate all your interest in this. It was awesome. So many people are interested, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Please feel free to email us at bchc04005@gmail.com, or with any questions or concerns, post comments in the chat, questions or concerns, or stay until the very end and just ask them when we're all unmuted. Thank you. And here we go. Jennie, thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks to the BCHC for hosting this presentation. And I also want to say thank you to Etz Chaim, because so what you're going to see tonight is largely drawn from a much larger project that I did about 15 years ago for Congregation Etz Chaim's 100th anniversary. I curated a museum exhibit. So without having that project under my belt, there's no way I would have been able to do this Zoom presentation. So thank you to Etz Chaim for sponsoring that 15 years ago. And of course, thank you to all of you for tuning in. It's really great to see this nice group here. I feel like I've made a few email friends over the past couple of weeks. I think we've got a really nice mix in the audience this evening of descendants from some of the old Jewish families from Biddeford Saco, also some Jewish transplants to the area, as well as some non-Jewish participants who are here to learn about and appreciate the history of the community. So I just want to thank everyone. So now I'm going to share my screen so I can show you my presentation. Yeah?
There you go.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. All right, so let's start at the beginning and talk about the emigration of Jews to Biddeford Saco. So who were Biddeford Saco's first Jewish residents? Where did they come from, and why did they come here? So they were primarily Ashkenazi Jews, meaning Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And specifically the ones that came to Biddeford were mostly from Eastern Europe, from the parts of Europe that we now call Poland, Russia, Belarus, and Lithuania. But of course, at that time, a lot of that area was just part of the Russian Empire. So why did they come? Well, really for three intertwined reasons. One being to escape religious persecution. And this not only included the the pogroms, but it included systemic prejudice that was rampant in the Russian Empire, as well as kind of your everyday prejudice and mistreatment. I remember my grandfather telling me that he remembered his mother telling him about how the Russians, the non-Jewish Russians, would collect their smallpox scabs and come into the Jewish villages and throw the scabs through the windows of the Jewish homes. So there was a real deep-seated hatred that they lived with on a day-to-day basis. Another reason why they wanted to get out of the Russian Empire was to escape conscription in the Russian army. So prior to 1827, Jews were not even allowed in the Russian army. They didn't want them in there. But then the laws changed in 1827 when the Russians realized that they could use Jews in the military to their advantage. One reason is that it was a source of basically dispensable bodies that they could put in the front lines of battle so they could spare the lives of non-Jews. And they also realized that Jews in the Jews service in the military could be used to help them in their efforts to convert Jews to Christianity. So they would offer incentives to Jewish soldiers if they were willing to convert. History shows us that this was not a very, there was a minuscule amount of people who, quote, took advantage of this. Not many actually converted. But in any case, conscription in the Russian army was, really often seen as a death sentence. So it was a huge reason to get out of there. And people were willing to do all kinds of crazy things not to have to go into the Russian army. And, I'm sure a lot of us have heard the stories of teenage boys fleeing into the woods and cutting off their trigger finger in hopes that, the Russians wouldn't take them. And they were allowed to take boys as young as 12. So on paper, legally, they could take boys as young as 12, but in practice, they were taking boys as young as 8, 9 years old. So it was something to be avoided at all costs. And then, of course, the third reason for coming was to seek better economic opportunity. For the average Jew living in the Russian Empire, there was very little opportunity, and America was, of course, the land of prosperity. So there were 2 waves of Jewish immigration to Biddeford, and these 2 waves basically mimicked the 2 waves of Jewish immigration to the United States as a whole. Interestingly, these 2 waves and the respective sizes of them, the first wave kind of being more of a little blip than compared to the second wave, but they correlate with the 2 surges of pogroms in the Russian Empire. So the first wave happened in the 1880s. That was the smaller one. And it was really just a handful of families who came. So you can see in the middle of your screen, the Goldstein or Goldstone family. They came from the Russian-Polish border, arriving in Biddeford in 1883. On the left, Hyman Gudkowski emigrated from Poland around 1885. And on the right side, Joseph Polakowicz there is on the left, and he came from the area likely right where the Prussian-Russian border was in what is modern day Poland. So the second wave came at the turn of the century, and this is an actual boat, the Finland, that used to run between Europe and Ellis Island. And this happens to be the boat that my great-grandfather took to come over. So to give you a sense of size, it was 580 feet long, 60 feet wide, and it held a total of 1,162 passengers. So why Biddeford, of all places? Well, at the time, Portland, Maine was a point of entry into the United States. So some people logically just stayed put. Biddeford was kind of a second location, like it wasn't really someone's primary destination. Often they went to other places first. Sometimes they went to big cities and found the living conditions were deplorable. Other times they went to even, nice, almost rural type places like Rumford, Maine, but that didn't have the economic opportunity that they needed. And Biddeford, of course, had that economic opportunity because of the mills. So often it would be family members or landsmen, friends from the old country who would encourage people to come to Biddeford. So I will share a little bit about my family's emigration story, just because it starts off very typical. So at that time, it was extremely expensive to get a ticket, even a third-class ticket to cross the ocean. So often it would be the man of the family who would buy the ticket. He would come over, get himself situated, find a place to live, find a job, and save up money to send, to get tickets to bring the rest of the family over. So my great-grandfather, Harry, left Russia in 1904, and he left behind his wife, Jennie, who is there on the left of your screen, who was 5 months pregnant at the time with their oldest child, Eva. And this photo was taken in Russia right before Jennie and Eva left to come reunite with Harry in the US. And we think that, it was probably an extravagance at that time to have a professional photo taken. And we think that they probably did that because it was a dangerous journey, and people, especially babies, didn't always make it. So they wanted to be sure that he would at least be able to see what she looked like. Sure enough, she did contract scarlet fever on the boat. And Jennie did not have the money to pay the doctor's bill. And so he ordered the baby to be thrown overboard. Fortunately, there were some people on the boat who could speak English, and they intervened on her behalf. They went directly to the ship's captain, and he spared Eva. He let her live. He just put them both in quarantine. So a lot of things could and did go wrong during these journeys, and the details certainly differ from family to family, but it was not rare for there to be some very serious mishaps. The case of another local family, the Zaitlins, who you see on the right, had another kind of horror story of their own. Hyman Zaitlin emigrated from Russia in 1913. And his wife, Rose, and 18-month-old son, Irving, attempted to join him in 1914, but they couldn't cross the Russian border because of the outbreak of World War I. And it took them 8 years to finally reunite. So I'll talk a little bit now about the early years of local Judaism. So there was, obviously, when the first Jews arrived, there was no synagogue. But they did have Torah scrolls that had been brought from Europe, and they held services in community members' homes in Biddeford. In 1892, the Hebrew congregation officially organized under President Hyman Gudkowsky. And we know that by 1894, they were gathering at St. Antoine's Hall, which was known as the Jewish Hall, at 26 Alfred Street, which, if Google Maps is giving me correct information, that's, for those who know it, the Jewel of India restaurant. We also know that they met at the Knights of Pythias Hall at 260 Main Street, which I think is the Paquin and Carroll Insurance Building next to Biddeford Savings Bank. And they also met at the home of Nathan Shapiro at 5 Pool Street. We know that by 1900, they were being served by Biddeford's first known rabbi, Hershey Hazid. In June of 1907, they officially incorporated under the name Biddeford Hebrew Synagogue Association. And Louis Polakowicz was elected president. They elected a new slate of officers at that time. And the community raised $1,100 for a down payment on the Episcopal Church, which had been built in 1874 on Bacon Street, of all places. And they took out a mortgage for $3,000 from Saco Savings Bank. At that time, they set the annual family dues. Membership was $7.80, and that was payable in weekly installments of 15 cents. In 1910, they renamed the Congregation Etz Chaim, which means Tree of Life, reportedly in honor of Chaim Gudkowski, who was the first president of the Hebrew congregation of Bidderford. And the photos that you see, the one on the left was taken in 1908, so not too long after they bought the building, and you can see that the building's bell tower is still there. The one on the right was taken in 1955, so it looks much more like it does now. So it was originally established as an Orthodox congregation. The congregation followed strict religious traditions that had been brought over from Europe. The services were all in Hebrew. Men and women sat separately, and of course, women were not allowed to read from the Torah. One of the early challenges was that, it was great on the one hand that they had the building and that they had a place to call their own, but the mortgage was using up so much of the funds so they were using up so much of the funds that they couldn't afford a full-time rabbi. So their solution was to create a combination position of cantor, kosher butcher, shochet, which is the slaughterer, and janitor. And as you can imagine, this was not a really popular position because someone who was learned enough to be a cantor probably did not want to scrub the toilets in the synagogue. So, so it's not surprising that they had a hard time keeping anyone in this position. So after a couple of years, they just forgot about that and they just relied upon their most learned members to lead the services. So it was a really big deal in 1939 when they finally paid off the building. And they had a special service with a celebratory dinner, and they literally set fire to the mortgage papers. So another challenge that they likely faced early on, other than the lack of money, was the fact that this was an entire congregation of immigrants. So it wasn't like when the Ashkenazi Jews came to New York and there was already this whole population of German Jews who had come before them, who could, kind of show them the ropes. Nobody was a native speaker. And, they didn't let that hold them back. They managed to do a lot of things. They managed to officially incorporate, to buy a building. So many of them became business owners. But I would imagine that things were not easy, as no one had formal educations and English skills were quite limited. And nowhere is this more evident than in the book in which the minutes from the board meeting were kept. So in 1919, they decided to come up with a constitution for the synagogue. So of course, it was the job of the secretary to keep the minutes. Now, one would assume that the person acting as secretary was probably someone who was one of the more capable ones when it came to English. Bernard Weinstein was serving as secretary at this time when they wrote the Constitution. And it's just kind of funny if you look at the language, like number 2, not a member from the synagogue has no right, W-R-I-G-H-T, to be present at a meeting when he don't behave himself. Or number 4, not a member from us does mix in our affairs, so the president of the synagogue has the right to tell him to keep his mouth shut. So on the one hand, it's you know, it's kind of funny and makes you chuckle, but on the other hand, it really makes you appreciate those early Jewish pioneers in Biddeford all the more for their strength and their tenacity to overcome these obstacles and to pave the way for the congregation. So Hebrew education was always has been integral to Jewish culture. As a culture, Jews place strong emphasis on education. And in fact, Judaism and education are so intertwined that the Yiddish word for synagogue, shul, literally means school. In the early years, private Hebrew lessons were given at the home of children, boys, and some girls as well, by the learned men of the community. And by 1915, we know that a man named Max Cohen was giving lessons to children in his home. By 1922, Etz Chaim had established a Talmud Torah, a Hebrew school, and the first teacher they hired was Mr. Kodkov for the grand salary of $40 a week. And Mr. Kodkov taught in the unfinished basement of the synagogue where the mikvah, or the ritual bath, was. Both boys and girls attended afternoons, Monday through Thursday, as well as Sunday mornings. And these were, you know, primarily American-born children of immigrants. You know, they spoke English. They probably spoke Yiddish too at home, but, you know, these were very rigid lessons conducted entirely in Hebrew, and the kids were not interested in this. They found it extremely boring, but they liked being with their peers. They liked that part a little too much. Because Mr. Kodkov had a real heck of a time with them. They would not sit still. They would not listen. They wouldn't stop talking. So he had his hands full, and he tried different things. He tried separating the boys from the girls, thinking that that might help. So he sent the boys upstairs and kept the girls downstairs. But that resulted in 2 groups of kids and one Mr. Kodkov who was running up and down the stairs all afternoon. So he had his work cut out for him. Well, in 1945, the synagogue hired Rabbi Akiba Zilberberg, and he only stayed 2 years, but he's credited with reorganizing the Hebrew school, making it less rigid, putting more English in, and using more user-friendly books. And here, this is just a clipping from the Biddeford Daily Journal from the early 50s of the Hebrew school's model Seder for Passover. So of course, the culmination of Hebrew education was the bar mitzvah ceremony for boys. So at the age of 13, they would be called up to read from the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. And they would do this in front of the congregation for the very first time, and it's a coming of age ceremony. So the bar mitzvah ceremonies at Etz Chaim, you know, in this first generation of kids who were becoming bar mitzvah, they were not big, lavish affairs like bar mitzvahs are today. You know, basically you got called up and you did the service, and then afterwards the congregation would, you know, just gather for some simple snacks that the bar mitzvah's mom made, maybe some pickled herring or some cookies. And there was no counterpart to the bar mitzvah for girls until the 1920s, when the bas mitzvah was born out of the Reform movement in Judaism. But this was an Orthodox congregation, and they were not even close to accepting that in the 1920s. But by 1956, under Rabbi Boris Gottlieb, they did have the first ever bas mitzvah at Etz Chaim. There were 5 girls in the same Hebrew school class who were approaching age 13. And so they had a group bas mitzvah. And it wasn't exactly like, it wasn't the equivalent of a bar mitzvah in the sense that they were not allowed to read from the Torah. So the girls gave speeches in English on Jewish matters, and they sang Jewish songs. They didn't have the honor of having their own ceremony. It was a group ceremony. But nevertheless, this was a really big step for the congregation at the time. And the girls were given certificates and gifts, a Hebrew Bible with an inscription, a commemorative bracelet, and they held a reception afterwards at the Lafayette Hotel in Old Orchard Beach, which was a kosher hotel, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So by the 70s, membership at the synagogue had hit an all-time low. And so consequently, there was no Hebrew school throughout the 70s and most of the 80s. The Jewish kids had to go to Portland for Hebrew school. And we'll get into a little bit later in the presentation about the revitalization that happened at Etz Chaim in the late 80s and 90s. But one of the consequences of that revitalization was the creation of the York County Community Hebrew School. It was established in 1988 with 10 students and 1 teacher. And in 1993, Etz Chaim held its very first truly egalitarian bas mitzvah with Sarah Rubin's ceremony, and you see her on the right. And not only was that the first egalitarian bas mitzvah, but it was the first bar or bas mitzvah that Etz Chaim had had in 30 years. So while we're talking about bas mitzvah and girls coming of age, we'll talk about the role of women in those early years. So historically, Jewish women played a relatively small role in public religious life. Their primary expression of religion was by keeping a kosher home. They didn't count towards the minyan, which is the quota of 10 people. And at the time it was 10 men that you need in order to conduct a service. So they didn't count, and so they didn't show up generally, except for the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So very early on, when the building still had the bell tower had a staircase that led to a balcony that overlooks the sanctuary. And that was where the women and the children sat, separate from the men. When they got rid of the bell tower, the women sat in what we still call the little shul, which is the room right next to the sanctuary, divided by a wall with windows. And the windows had sheer curtains, so the women could hear what was going on, but they were discouraged from peeking at the men, although some of them remember that they still like to do that. It was the late 30s, early 40s when women were finally allowed to sit in the main sanctuary. However, they were still expected to, they sat on one side of the aisle. So men on one side, women and young children on the other. By the late 50s, early 60s, the congregation took the next step toward gender egalitarianism by tolerating men who crossed over from the men's side to the women's side to sit with their families. But they were tolerated, but they were expected to sit in the back pews and leave the front pews as single sex. So of course, looking at this through our modern lens, it seems very patriarchal and that women were somewhat marginalized, but it was a different time. And the women, they weren't without power, influence, or responsibility at the synagogue. In 1910, they created the Ladies' Aid Society, which existed to not only raise money for the synagogue, but also to raise money for newly arrived immigrants to help them get situated. And then later they created the Ladies Auxiliary, also known as the Sisterhood, and they had elected officers and several committees, each of which had a chairwoman. And in 1961, that was the first year that the synagogue held a joint installation ceremony for synagogue officers as well as the Ladies Auxiliary officers. And the Ladies Auxiliary ended up disbanding in the early 80s. So since we're talking about women, we'll transition to discussing the local chapters of national Jewish organizations by talking about the most important organization for Jewish women, which of course was Hadassah. Hadassah is a women's Zionist organization, and the goal was to raise money to improve the quality of life in Palestine, or later Israel. So they were devoted to medical causes, educational causes, environmental, anything having to do with youth, especially disadvantaged youth. And the Biddeford Saco chapter of Hadassah was very, very active. They met monthly, they held yearly donor dinners, annual meetings to elect officers, and they were constantly busy doing some form of fundraising or another. Two of the things that they used to do for fundraisers was to hold raffles and rummage sales. The rummage sales were very popular with the community at large, not just the Jewish community. So the way it worked is that Jewish families would donate their unwanted clothing or household items, and they had a reputation for having very nice quality clothing. So the landlords from downtown stores that happened to be empty at the time would let the ladies use the storefronts to set up the sale, and there would be citizens of Biddeford and Saco lined up and down the streets early in the morning, waiting for the doors to open. What you see here is a banner from the Biddeford Saco chapter of Hadassah that is kind of sporting all their fundraising badges and patches that they received for all of their fundraising efforts. And Hadassah, this chapter ended up disbanding in the early 80s, and the Portland chapter absorbed the few members that were left. So the men, of course, had their chapters as well. There was the ZOA, the Zionist Organization of America, and that was really kind of like the men's equivalent of Hadassah. They worked to reestablish a Jewish state in the Holy Land. And then once Israel was established in 1948, they worked to benefit and support Israel. B'nai B'rith chapter was created in 1935. It was named for a departed prominent citizen of Saco, Samuel M. Solmer. They met monthly. They also advocated for Israel, but they were more broadly focused on humanitarian purposes, working for public benefit, things like, awarding a needy student who wanted to go to college a scholarship. They often invited officers from churches and fraternal orders in the area to come to their meetings so they could learn from one another and work together for the greater good of the community. There was Aleph Zedek Aleph, and that's basically, it was a teenage boy version of B'nai B'rith. So basically like a high school fraternity that was focused on community service and Jewish enrichment programs. And of course, the Workmen's Circle, or the Arbiter Ring, was a fraternal order that supported labor and socialist movements. They worked for social change in the United States. They worked to provide members health and death benefits. And then in later years, they worked to promote Jewish education and to preserve the Yiddish language and Yiddish arts and culture. In 1946, 20 men in the community were granted a charter to create the Osher Edelstein Post, which was a chapter of the national headquarters of the Jewish war veterans of the United States. So there was a significant number of local Jewish men who served in World War II. So many of them were gone, in fact, that a plaque with their names was kept in front of the synagogue during the war years. And it was a handmade plaque by a community member, Benjamin Remar of Biddeford, who excelled in his hobby of woodworking. So whenever a local Jewish boy was being deployed, Benjamin Stern, who was a Maine state legislator and a Jewish resident of Biddeford, would meet the boy at the train station and see him off, give him cigarettes and little gifts. And in 1942, there was a whole group of young Jewish men from the Biddeford Saco community who boarded the same train and went off to basic training together. And that included Freddie Green and Ivan Aranovitch and George Cohen and several others. And fortunately, every single one of them returned. It wasn't just the men who served in the war who contributed to the war effort. The local B'nai B'rith chapter created recreational facilities at various military posts in southern Maine to help keep the troops' morale up. They also, they dedicated this plaque with, that you see in the middle of your screen, that they dedicated that to all the Jewish community members who served in the military. And that plaque is still hanging on the wall of Etz Chaim. So we'll delve a little bit deeper now into community and cultural life. So because of the all-encompassing nature of Orthodox Judaism, the synagogue was not just the center of religious life, but it was really very embedded in community and cultural life as well. The three were very much intertwined, I would say a lot more so than today. So what do I mean by that? So some of the most basic things about how you lived your life were at the time dictated by religion. So for example, where you lived and what you ate. So we'll look first at the question of where you lived. Orthodox interpretation of Jewish law prohibits driving on the Sabbath. So even when cars became widely available and widely affordable, Jewish families still needed to live within walking distance of the synagogue. So the area right around the synagogue was where the Jewish families lived. So Bacon Street, Poole Street, Foss Street, parts of Alfred Street, you know, this was the Jewish neighborhood. And partly because of the fact that there weren't all that many of them, partly because they had so many differences from their Christian neighbors, and partly because they all lived so close together, the community was extremely close-knit. Jewish people did not knock on their Jewish neighbors' doors. And Jewish children grew up physically close together, so naturally they played together, they created close, lifelong bonds. And this closeness was both a blessing and a curse. So there was always this support system in place, you know, always someone to leave your child with, always someone to cook you a meal if you were sick. The downside was that privacy was not always respected, and people felt very free to butt into your business. An example of this would play out on Yom Kippur, when it would not be uncommon for someone to come up to you and say in the synagogue, "Show me your tongue." Well, first, for those who don't know, Yom Kippur is a fasting holiday. You're not supposed to eat or drink. So they would say, "Show me your tongue." If you stuck out your tongue and it was white, that proved that you had obeyed the fast. But if you stuck out your tongue and it was pink, then you were marked for gossip. Jewish law also has strict dietary guidelines, and following these laws is what's meant by keeping kosher. So to put things in a very, very tight nutshell, it means only eating meat from certain animals that have been killed in a certain way by a qualified person, and keeping meat and dairy completely separate. So you have a different set of dishes, of silverware, of cookware for your meat meals versus your dairy meals. So the first known kosher butcher in Biddeford was Max Shear, and he had a place on Foss Street. Shear was pretty disliked by the Jewish community, and so the Cohen family, Julius and Celia Cohen, they helped bring a second butcher named Mordechai Cohen. There was no relation. They helped bring him to Biddeford from Palestine in the mid-30s, and he opened a butcher shop at the corner of Hill and Granite Streets. We know that there were at least 2 other men in the community who slaughtered chickens. So they would travel to the homes of people who either owned their own chickens, or they would go to a local farmer from whom a Jewish family had ordered a chicken and perform the slaughter for a fee. And Morris Nathanson, in addition to serving as spiritual leader at Etz Chaim from 1936 to 1945, was also a chicken slaughterer. And he would walk 3 miles in any direction to go slaughter a chicken, and he charged 5 cents a bird. By the 1950s, with fewer and fewer families keeping kosher, the Biddeford butchers had gone out of business. So you had to go to Portland to get your kosher meat. Although for several years after that, there was still a kosher butcher shop in Old Orchard Beach, but that was only open in the summertime. On your screen there, you see a picture of a chalaf, or a ritual slaughtering knife that was used by one of Biddeford's, a Biddeford showcat. I'm not sure which one, but he ended up giving it to my great-grandmother for some reason. And this one we know was made to slaughter cattle. We know that from the length of the blade, because Jewish law says that the blade has to be twice as long as the width of the animal's neck that it's being used to slaughter. And I couldn't capture it with the camera, but there's nearly an invisible Jewish star that is kind of etched into the blade. You have to look really hard to see it, but it's there. So really, I mean, keeping kosher was just another way to kind of, it's hard to socialize with people whose plates you can't eat off of. So, it kind of brought people closer together and solidified that bond. Another thing keeping these families very bound together was the fact that many of them were related through marriage. With such a small Jewish population in Biddeford, there weren't a whole lot of potential Jewish marriage partners. So in the early generations, you see marriages mainly between 2 members of local Jewish families, or sometimes a Biddeford Jew would marry a Portland Jew. But often during that time, Jewish families would have a branch of the family in Portland and a branch of the family in Biddeford. So in any case, there was a strong likelihood that when you got married, you'd end up becoming related through marriage to another Biddeford Jewish family. So really the expression one big family certainly pertains to the early Jewish population in Biddeford. A very large percentage of the community was Mahatunim, or in-laws. So some of you might be familiar with the party game, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Well, at Etz Chaim, you can play 3 Degrees of Semensky, because I think at one point in time, like half the congregation was related through marriage to the Semensky family. At least 14 families were related just in this one cluster, and there were other clusters of related families as well. So in 1948, there was a big rift in the Jewish community, and that was between the progressives and the traditionalists. The progressives wanted to get rid of the mikvah, the ritual bath that was in the basement. They wanted to finish the basement, to have that extra space. And they ended up winning that debate, and the mikvah was taken out and the basement was finished, complete with a kosher kitchen. And this really opened up many more opportunities for community events. With this vestry or social hall, they had a proper place to socialize after weddings or bar mitzvahs. It provided meeting space to the organizational chapters that used the synagogue as a meeting place. They were able to hold dances with live music, formal dinners. The women used this for a lot of their fundraising efforts by having bake sales and bake auctions. There's also a stage, as you can see. So there were performances and special events. So I think that in some ways that fear that the traditionalists had that getting rid of the mikvah would be one step towards weakening the ties to Judaism really turned out to be unfounded, because I think the vestry ended up bringing people even closer together and fortifying those social bonds and their bonds to the synagogue. In fairness to the traditionalists, who I think my family belonged to that camp, in fairness to them, the community certainly found ways to celebrate together, even without the vestry. This picture on the left was taken in around 1938, so 10 years before they finished the basement. And they're having what appears to be maybe a breakfast meal at the conclusion of Yom Kippur. I'm not really sure, but the point is that they're doing it right there in the sanctuary. And even in modern days, we've been known to party it up in the sanctuary. There on the right, you see a photo from the Journal Tribune that appeared in 2003. And that was taken at the synagogue's annual York County Community Hanukkah party, featuring the klezmer music of the Casco Tumblers, who I think, with the exception of last year because of COVID, have been playing that party for close to 30 years now. Of course, home life also reinforced Jewish culture in a lot of different ways, not least of all being the celebration of holidays and other family celebrations. And these are just a couple of nice Passover Seder photos that were taken in the 50s of a couple local families. And certainly Jewish values were taught at home. The value of tzedakah, or charity, for example, could be seen carried out in virtually every household by the presence of these little tin boxes called pushkis. They're basically little banks for different Jewish charities, and you would just put your spare change in, and when they'd get full, you'd empty it out and send the money to the charity. The pushki on the left is an antique one that belonged to Celia Cohen of Biddeford, who reportedly lined the insides of her kitchen cupboards with dozens and dozens of pushkis. And the one on the right is a more modern one from the 80s. Another Jewish value is the value of doing mitzvot, or good deeds. And here we have this great photo in the middle from the Biddeford Daily Journal, 1959, of Kerry Snyder at his bar mitzvah at Etz Chaim. And he is receiving the Ner Tamid Eternal Light Award from the National Jewish Committee of the Boy Scouts of America, which I think really reflects this nice overlap of the traditional Jewish commitment to mitzvot and the very kind of all-American, apple pie-ish institution of the Boy Scouts. And Carrie was the first and probably the only bar mitzvah boy to receive that honor at Etz Chaim. So all of these things that I've talked about that bound the Jewish community together, where they lived, where and how they worshiped, what they valued, who their friends were, what and where they ate. All of these things also, of course, had the effect of making them different from the other residents in Bidderford. And the immigrant generation wasn't too bothered by this. They certainly learned enough English to to get by, and they interacted with non-Jews when doing business, but they were okay with being regarded as different. But for their children who were born here in Biddeford, it was a different story. They were much more interested in fitting in. And they more or less got along pretty well with the children of other ethnicities at public school. But the process of getting to school was very frightening, particularly for the Jewish boys, if they had to walk by the parochial schools, because if they went by the parochial schools, they were often called names in French, they were often chased, and if they were caught, they were beaten up. So they recall in their youth running as fast as they could past the parochial schools. But ironically, it was really the Jewish boys more than the girls who ended up forming friendships with non-Jewish boys at school, and that was primarily because of sports. And this is just a great, I love this photo. It's of the 1927 Emory Grammar School baseball team. They were city champs that year. They defeated the rival teams from St. Joseph, St. Mary's, and St. Andre's. So they captured the city title, and you can see their victory cup in the foreground there. And when you look at the names of the boys on the team, you know, you can see there are the Greek boys and the Anglo boys and the French boys and the Jewish boys. And it's just interesting to me because, you know, the Greek boys are standing together in the back left, and the Jewish boys are standing together, that front right triangle, dark-haired boys are the Jewish boys. So they're all kind of keeping with their own ethnic group, but you know, the bigger picture is that they were all on this team together, having fun and clearly doing a very good job of it. So we'll change gears a little bit now to talk about what the Jewish immigrants did here in Bideford to make a living. I mentioned before Bideford was a draw because of the mills, and the mills were a draw for a couple of different reasons. So for one, they provided a job that you didn't really need a lot of English for. It was a potential, you know, quick source of income, but not a lot of Jews took this route. If they did do mill work, it was really very temporary. It was just used as a stepping stone, you know, while they saved up some money. But the mills were a draw to Jewish people for another reason, and that was because of the mills, the cities were booming, and so there were people moving here from Canada, from all over, to work in the mills. So there was this whole population of consumers who needed to set up house, and they needed to buy what they needed in order to do that. They needed pots and pans and bedding and brooms and dustpans and whatever. So it was fairly common for Jewish men to become peddlers when they first arrived. So they could send away for a peddler's pack, which they would wear on their back, and they would walk door to door. And it was pretty grueling work, but if they did well at that, they could kind of get to the next step, which was to save up to buy a push cart, which allowed them to make more money because now they could sell in greater volume, they could sell larger, more expensive items. And then if they did well at that, they could do what Simon Epstein here did, which is get a horse-drawn wagon. And then the ultimate goal was to become a shopkeeper. And this was a common path that Jewish men took when they arrived, that even by 1900, so really before that second wave of immigration even really took off, you know, it was a pretty tiny Jewish population, but there were already 7 Jewish-owned shops in downtown Biddeford. So it really didn't take long for this mentality to develop, this notion in Biddeford Saco that Jews, quote, belonged on Main Street. So if you were Jewish and you went to apply for a mill job, you might be told, no, your kind doesn't make good mill workers. You belong on Main Street. some of the very first Jewish-owned Biddeford shops were owned by the Polakowicz family, and they were in the clothing business. So brothers Joseph and Louis arrived in 1885. In 1890, they opened Polakowicz Brothers, which was a clothing store at 2 Bacon Street. They later moved to Main Street, and around 1900, they purchased La Roche and Beaulieu, which was a men's clothing store at 120 Main Street, and they moved their shop there. And soon after that, Joe opened his own shop called Joe the Clothier across the street, and that operated until it went into the 30s. Meanwhile, Polakowicz Brothers became Louis Polakowicz and Sons. And then in 1918, when Joseph's son Louis got out of the military, he went into the clothing business and he ran Louis Polakowicz Incorporated, which remained open into the 80s. And Joe and Louis's brothers around 1910, David and Hyman, they both opened their own clothing store in Bidderford as well. Hyman opened H. Polakowicz, which was a women's clothing store. And that was open until 85, being taken over by Hyman's children, Raymond, who you see on the left in the hat and the coat, and his daughter Anne, who was second from left in the back row. So there were several other Jewish-owned clothing stores in Biddeford. As I mentioned before, the Jews had the reputation for having good quality clothing, and there was a reason for that. There were many, many Jewish-owned clothing stores. As you can see from these ads from the Biddeford directory over various years, there was Lublinsky's, Marks and Brothers. There was even a female-owned clothing store in 1920, Mrs. Minnie Semensky, who I think was a Goodkowski by birth, but there were many more than this too, lots and lots of clothing stores. Other early Jewish-owned shops included Eli the Cobbler's, which was a shoe shop opened in 1909 by Eli Lerman at 284 Main Street in Biddeford. There was a large stove inside the shop, and it attracted Biddeford policemen who were in the wintertime walking the night beat and wanted to go in to warm up. The top photos on the left show Eli's son Paul showing off a custom-made pair of shoes for a rather large-footed customer. He was there at the original shop on Main Street, and that was taken in the 60s. And then in the 70s, Paul and his wife Lucille moved the shop to the Biddeford Industrial Park, where you may remember, you might remember from what it looked like in the picture on the bottom there. So one of the last Jewish-owned retail shops in downtown Biddeford was Jack and Larry's jewelry shop. Jack and Larry Semensky were brothers, and they opened the store in 1949. Larry left the business a couple of years later, but Jack kept the name. And unfortunately, I didn't have a great photo of Jack and Larry's, but this is a photo of the 1969 Central Hotel fire on Alfred Street, where Jack and Larry's was originally located. After it was destroyed, it was rebuilt in at 135 Main Street, where it continued to operate into the 2000s. There were some businesses, Jewish-owned businesses in Biddeford related to food and drink. Biddeford had 3 Jewish-owned produce stores. There was S. Cohen Fruit and Produce, which was owned by Sam Cohen. There was Sandler Brothers Fruit and Produce, owned by Irving and Herman Sandler, and Central Fruit on Alfred Street, owned by the Walensky family. And even as late as the 1960s, the local children referred to that as the Jew store. There was York Bottling Company, owned by the Cohen family, Julius and Celia Cohen, which was established in 1912 on Elm Street, and the family lived in the rear of the building. And of course, there was Reuben and Rose Polakowicz's lunch counter on Main Street, Biddeford, that you see there in the 50s. There were a couple of Jewish hotel proprietors in the area. I mentioned the Lafayette Hotel earlier, which was run by the Gudkowski family. So Hyman's son, Joseph, and his wife, Rebecca, and their 5 children ran the Lafayette from 1909 to 1965, and it was a strictly kosher hotel. So it was a summer vacation spot for Jewish tourists from all over North America and abroad. And it served Etz Chaim well, especially before the vestry was created, because it allowed them to have functions with kosher food. The Columbia Hotel was owned by Harry and Jennie Aranovitch and was operated by them and their daughter Eva. That was established in 1926, located at the corner of Maine, Water and Hill Streets. The family lived on the first floor, and in the bottom basement level, there were various businesses over the years, including a barber shop, Doyon's Pharmacy, Bull's Cafe, and a beer hall run by 2 of the Aranovitch sons, Alex and Ivan. Isadore Shapiro opened a radiator repair shop on Franklin Street in Biddeford in 1921. And over the years, the business offered different services and operated under different names and in different locations, but always in Biddeford. And most recently, it was Union Oil on Main Street. And this photo on the left shows a vehicle around 1930 advertising Shapiro's radiator glass and tire service. The document you see on the right, so Isadore's son Arnold was a longtime president of Congregation Etz Chaim, and he placed this ad in the 1993 La Kermesse insert of the Journal Tribune. And for those who don't know, La Kermesse is the annual French festival in the area. So Arnold put this in at festival time. There are 2 types of people, those who are French and those who wish they were. And he signed it, "Best wishes, Arnold Shapiro," with Shapiro being spelled as if it were a French name. So that's a little bit of Arnold's humor coming through. There was Sam's Place, a hardware store, which was opened in around 1915 by Sam Osher. It was originally located on Water Street in Biddeford, and it later moved to Alfred Street.
Emailing.
And then Harold and Bella Cowan, who were a Jewish couple who were living in Bangor, they bought the business in 1964. And they ended up moving to Saco, and in 1968, they relocated the business from Biddeford to Main Street, Saco, where they ran it. Bella and her son Bernard were, they operated it until 2008. So we have to talk about the Saco businesses as well. Saco never had quite the Jewish population that Bidderford did, and so it never had quite the number of Jewish businesses that Bidderford did, but there were definitely a few of note. So Saco Junk, which later became Saco Steel, was established by Hyman Zeitlin on Water Street in Saco and later moved to Lund Road. And here we've got a picture of Harry Zeitlin in the Saco junk truck from around 1950. And then 20 plus years later, there's Harry standing in front of the scrap heap with Michael Zeitlin in the background operating the crane. We just talked about Sam's Place, which was relocated to Saco. And there was also Toby's Restaurant, which started off as Toby's Drive-In. It was a fast food establishment on Route 1 in Saco, and that was run by John and Toby Nathanson. So for the first few decades, the Jewish businesses in Bidderford and Saco were retail or service businesses. Jews were not opening professional white-collar businesses. In fact, there was not a single professional Jewish business in either city until about 1940. And this is not surprising because the immigrant generation was not formally educated. But once their children reached adulthood, of course, some of them continued in their parents' businesses, but some of them went off to college. And among those who came back as educated people, some established professional offices in the area. So after about 1950, we start to see this simultaneous decline in blue-collar Jewish businesses and an emergence of a small group of Jewish professionals in Biddeford. A couple of examples of the white-collar Jewish professionals during this decade. We have here Carl Haas, Dr. Carl Haas. This is an ad from an employee newsletter from the Pepperell Manufacturing. And this is advertising his free preschool exams for children of mill workers. And then on the right, there's Dr. Alvin Aaron, who had a dental practice first on Main Street in Biddeford, and then later moved it to Cutts Avenue in Saco. So this is a chart that's just showing kind of the life of Jewish downtown businesses over the years. The blue line represents the blue collar businesses. So your clothing stores, your shoe stores, fruit stores, hotels, grocery stores. The red line represents the white collar professional businesses. So the attorneys, accountants, dentists, doctors. And the peak of Jewish businesses overall was in 1950. Downtown Biddeford hit a peak of 30 blue-collar Jewish businesses and a peak of 5 white-collar Jewish businesses. And then you see a very steady decline of the blue-collar businesses after 1950, with the sharpest decline being in that decade between 1970 and 1980. So by the late 60s, Etz Chaim was facing hard times. Rabbi Boris Gottlieb, who had become the rabbi in 1954, left the synagogue in 1967. And the Jewish population in Biddeford Saco was declining as the older generation was dying off, and the younger generation was going off to college and getting married and settling in other places. And among the very small Jewish population that was left, there really wasn't much interest in going to an Orthodox synagogue. People had become less religious over the years and weren't interested in the rigidity of the Orthodox ways. So for over a decade, the synagogue was pretty much closed except for high holidays when a visiting rabbi or visiting cantor would come in. And at one point there were serious discussions about closing it altogether. But fortunately, things started turning around a little bit in the 80s. And the first thing that happened to turn the tide was that in 1981, Arnold Shapiro was elected president, and he started nudging the board towards being less orthodox. And by the late 80s, the congregation had in fact discontinued its Orthodox affiliation and became unaffiliated. In the 80s and 90s, there was an arrival of several young Jewish families to the area, not to Biddeford specifically, but more spread out throughout York County. And among those new families were the Strasslers, Beth and David Strassler, who were instrumental in working with Arnold to breathe new life into the synagogue. And in 1988, the York County Community Hebrew School opened. In 99, the Samuel Osher Memorial Library was established at the synagogue. 2001 saw some major renovations to the building when it became handicap accessible. And this chart shows the number of family memberships. And you can see the plummeting numbers from the peak of family membership, which was in 1955 with 125 families, very sharp decline down to 25 families in 1975. And then you see this really nice steady growth back up to the point where the synagogue had reached 100 families by its 100th anniversary. And it's still holding pretty steady there, and hopefully will continue to hold steady, if not increase in the years to come. So this is just a little glimpse of Congregation Etz Chaim today, or I should say pre-COVID. So Etz Chaim is now non-denominational or unaffiliated. It uses gender-sensitive prayer books with transliteration so that no matter how skilled you are in Hebrew, you can still follow along with services. There are bi-monthly Shabbat services led by the president of the synagogue, Dr. David Strassler, and his wife, Cantor Beth Strassler. There are monthly Friday night potluck suppers. There's Hebrew school and bar and bas mitzvahs. There's a weekly teen confirmation class, of course, high holiday services, a whole lot of community celebrations, an annual Purim party, Passover model Seder, a Tu B'Shvat Seder, and of course the annual Hanukkah party. The Samuel Osher Memorial Library has well over 3,000 Jewish books, movies, music, and educational materials for loan. There's a women's book club, various activities over the years. It's included everything from a mahjong group to wine tasting to Israeli dancing, lots of fun activities. And I know we're certainly looking forward to getting back to doing all those things in person as soon as possible. So I will stop there. I want to thank everyone for listening. I hope that you learned something, or maybe you enjoyed a memory or two. And at this point, we have some time for questions or comments.
Well, this is Sharon, and I'm was from that original bat mitzvah class, and so this was an amazing journey. And thank you, Jenny. I know you and I were in touch about 15 years ago, and I provided some of the documentation, but I realized that there's just so much more. And I had connections with a lot of the names and families.
Oh, you just went on mute.
So this was just, it was like going home again, and the fact that all these years, and it's great to see the pictures that the synagogue is surviving. So I'll go on mute and let others jump in.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm really glad that you could make it.
There's a question on the chat.
Yep.
Someone said, thanks for the great presentation. Could you address any of the following? Jewish workers in the mills. And I think you covered that. How the congregation interacted, if at all, with other local churches, such as the Catholic parishes, and the legends I've heard regarding the Ku Klux Klan in Saco.
I don't know anything about the Klan in Saco, so I can't speak to that. The only interaction that I know of between the Jewish community and other faiths is that the B'nai B'rith chapter invited other spiritual leaders from other faiths to come to their meetings, because so much of what they did was not necessarily focused on religion, but it was more about the community and doing good things for the community. And so they did include other faiths in that respect. In terms of the mill work, like I said, there were some Jews who worked in the mills, but it was usually very temporary. I do know that I remember my grandfather telling me, I don't know why, but in the 1940s, he had tried to get a job in the mill, and he had been told, "You don't belong here." So there really was this this notion that that was not the place for Jews. You should be a shopkeeper.
Thank you. There was another question. Said, when the Episcopal Church became the synagogue, was there any sort of ceremony to transition the space from Christianity to Judaism?
No, in fact, that's one thing that I have not been able to find any information on. I haven't even been able to find out when exactly the bell tower was raised. I know that they got rid of it because it was very churchy, for lack of a better term. But I don't even know when that happened, or exactly what they did to alter the building.
Somebody had asked about the bell tower too. Another comment from Leanne says, my grandfather, Isidore Shapiro, led a group of men across the bridge, Saco to Biddeford, and stopped the KKK from going any further.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
Well, I will be in touch with her to learn more about that.
Yeah.
There's a comment here, Jenny, from a gentleman, Roger, who wanted you to talk a bit about the Old Orchard Jewish population, if you had any information there.
Yeah, so I really kept this limited to Biddeford Saco, and the only reason why I went into the Lafayette Hotel was because the Goodkowskis who ran it were from Biddeford, and B, because it served such a important role for Etz Chaim, especially in those years before they had the vestry. They really utilized that because of the kosher catering. But honestly, there could be a whole separate presentation done about the Jews in Old Orchard Beach, because there was a lot of activity, a lot of business ownership there. And I that's not something that I have tackled yet.
Yeah, the hotel in Old Orchard, that was the site of the party for the first bat mitzvah. And we were not, as girls, not allowed to have our bat mitzvah on Saturday. And so therefore it was planned on a Sunday. And it was made really clear that we didn't.
Is there anything else, Diane?
Somebody did make a comment when you showed the plaque, I can't think of one, of the veterans,
Yeah.
that Nancy responded that her aunt was actually on that veterans plaque. So it wasn't just men.
It wasn't. In fact, when I was getting the names off of that plaque for you, Diane, for the veterans event that BCHC did, that was honestly the first time that I noticed it wasn't all men. It's absolutely right. There were one or two women.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's it. I mean, I was thank you, Jenny, for this whole presentation, because I learned a few things and know that we had interviewed a couple people. I know the Strassers were very instrumental in the changes at the Congregation Etz Chaim.
Hey,
Yeah, you got it.
Diane?
Yeah.
Diane?
Hi,
So this is David Strassler.
hi, Dr. Strassler.
I'm the president now, and I'm here with my wife, Kendra Strassler. Jenny, you did such a great job.
Thank you.
So we just want to acknowledge once again, when we came in the early 80s, we can't say enough about Arnold and his wife, Barbara Shapiro, Sam Cohn, Johnny and Toby Nathanson, Sam Carlin, that they really went against all odds to keep the shul open. And they really put themselves out on a limb when there was a split. And they were very receptive to help the next generation come forth. So we really feel need to acknowledge that as much as we can. So, but thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful, once again.
Thanks, David. Well, thank you everyone again for coming. For those of you who want to stay on for a couple more minutes, we're going to play a little slideshow of photos that were taken at the opening reception of the museum exhibit, as well as at the open house that Etz Chaim had 15 years ago. So for those who might want an extra little trip down memory lane, you'll see some familiar faces, some of whom unfortunately aren't with us anymore. We're going to let this loop through a couple of times. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you coming. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.